for me, the most important purpose of my presentation is to convince you of that. I warned my colleagues about this, but maybe they weren't aware that I will be quite so shameless about this. I want you to believe afterwards that this is really an exciting topic. And the reasons are really, I see three reasons. Okay, I don't claim to be objective, I am biased, but I do think there are three important reasons. There is so much waste and so little research. If you, all those of you who are listening to me now, literally everything that you see right now will be waste in the near future. The screen that you're looking at, the computer that you're looking at, the whatever's in your room that you're looking at, whatever artwork or pictures in your room will be waste. What you're wearing on your body, in fact, you will be waste. I will be waste in some future. It's just a matter of time. So it is, if you think about it, it's really a huge topic in that whatever exists will at some point be waste. And I'm not saying there is no research that is going on there, but in proportion to how much it really is part of our lives, I think it is woefully little. It is literally about everything. And at the same time, it's not only a lot, but it's also conceptually interesting, but it's also quite unclear what it actually is. And I would like to give you an example for both of these aspects. The first is for the sheer mass that exists in the world. In May 2017, there were researchers from the University of Tasmania who happened to arrive on Henderson Island, which is an uninhabited island, but birds live there, and this is where they went there, and they found a beach littered with plastic waste. So they found 38 million pieces of plastic waste weighing a combined 17.6 tons. This wouldn't be such a big piece of news if you didn't know where Henderson was. Henderson is there, it's part of the Pitcairn Islands. It's in the middle of nowhere. You can't get anywhere on Earth that's further away from anything. Certainly from any industrial area or from any area that is even inhabited to any great degree. I mean, those other islands are very sparsely inhabited. Several aren't inhabited at all. So if that place looks like that, that means we have a lot of waste in the world, that we have a problem. And this is a projection by the OECD. If you look at the development of the last century from 1900 to the year 2000, you'll see that waste has really increased explosively. This is in million tons per day. That is the waste generation in million tons per day. And probably more interesting even that there are several projections for the future. No projection believes that waste will decrease. Basically, pretty much they agree that by the year 2050, which probably most of those people who are listening to me now will be there, waste will have doubled, which if you look around the world today is really disconcerting. And then the projections or the scenarios only differ in the degree to which waste will then continue further. Of course, these are no prophecies. We don't know what the future will be like, but it's very difficult to imagine today that waste will actually decrease. So if I believe it's a big issue now, it will be even bigger just some decades from now. But at the same time, it's unclear what it is. I will just give you one example. This is waste. What goes in there is waste. This is fertilizer, this is food, and this is waste again. What we consider waste depends on context. There is a famous definition by Mary Douglas, actually quite old already, but she defined dirt, which is sort of like waste, as being matter out of place. And while I was preparing for this morning, I came up with a new idea, and which I hope from today on will spread widely in academia and will make me famous. I believe you could also say waste is something that does not disappear. If it somehow dissolves again into the world and is being reduced and then disappears, it's no longer waste. It's something that forms part of a cycle. But if it just sits there and does not go away, that is certainly waste. So, what is also interesting about waste is that it's so multidimensional. It has this developmental dimension, which of course is interesting to the center, because it comes with connotations of progress. If very backward societies don't have waste, if you're very, very poor, you typically don't produce a lot of waste. It has to do with the relation to perceived modernization, however you define that. It's certainly a function of asymmetries between different societies or different countries. There's certainly a social dimension in that there's always a relation to wealth and poverty. It's typically the wealthy that produce a lot of waste, while it's the poor that have to somehow deal with it. It therefore is also a topic of environmental justice, and again of power asymmetries. There's certainly a very strong cultural dimension in that it has to do with attitudes that different people have towards waste, that has to do with stigmas or taboos or disgust. But these differ depending on cultures around, and they can also change in the course of time. There's certainly an economic dimension. It has to do with production and design of products, with the recycling, with planned obsolescence, and also with trade of waste. Actually, waste products today are one of the largest quantity of things that are being traded around the world. There's undoubtedly the environmental dimension, which has to do with disposal and with the effects of waste on flora and fauna, and also the effects on climate change. The political dimension, it has effects on humans and other living beings. It's often regulated. There are attempts to regulate this through agreements. It is dealt with through international relations, or by governments, or by international organizations. And all these dimensions are also interlinked. So I added interdisciplinary, which basically means all of the above, everything here. That's why I think it is really very exciting. And I would like to give you 3 examples. And for the reason that will become clear to you, these are only 3 examples of a lot, but I can't talk about everything. So the first example refers to my own research, which is on how international organizations deal with waste. So the first that I have found, well, to the best of my knowledge, the first organization that became active in the field of waste was the League of Nations Health Organization, which then consequently was mostly interested in the health aspect. And it addressed waste in the context, first of all, of rural hygiene, so hygiene of people living in the countryside, where it was interested in the separation of waste from, that was human waste, toilet, from drinking water, and the protection against flies from manure, because they were infection, but they carried infectious diseases. And secondly, in the large program they had about housing, where they first of all started taking stock of municipal waste, and that was the time when it became obvious that really that was growing a lot in industrialized countries. And then the problem was how to remove this from housing, either through collection or through sewage. And then once it was had been removed, it was away from houses, what do you do with it in the long run? How do you eventually dispose of it? And these were the possibilities that were being discussed. So it could be deposited on landfills or in the sea, which basically means you dump it someplace. You put it someplace far away, either on land or in the sea, and hope it doesn't bother anybody anymore. You can burn it in incinerators. You can feed it to animals, but of course not all of it. You can try to recycle it, or it can be fermented into fertilizer. And basically this hasn't changed very much. These are pretty much the alternatives that are still around today. which is also something that I find interesting, that even, you know, after a century, the possibilities of what you can do with waste don't seem to change very much. After 1945, it's the World Health Organization that takes over, and continues with these two topics, human waste and municipal solid waste, but then adds atomic waste. This is the late 1940s and then the 1950s, when nuclear energy atomic energy, when Eisenhower has this Atoms for Peace speech, this is very much on the international agenda, and atomic waste becomes an issue. And increasingly more organizations enter the field. So this is the WHO, then it's the International Atomic Energy Agency, which obviously has to be interested in atomic waste. The World Bank becomes interested in sanitation and sewage, and also municipal solid waste as part of their development programs, which they finance in various countries. And the Food and Agriculture Organization deals with manure, organic waste, and fertilizer. So by that time, we're about by the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you have a huge increase in attention to waste, which is also reflected in international organizations. So NATO becomes interested in it. The OECD, so the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, is actually the first organization that has its own commission specifically dedicated to waste and addresses those issues, industrial waste, oily waste, packaging, and starts plans for a comprehensive strategy, which never go very far. Then the UNECE, UN Economic Commission for Europe, also jumps on the bandwagon, and the UN Environmental Program, which is actually, maybe surprisingly, the last one that becomes active there. And if you then look at what these organizations work on, I try to put this into some sort of order, or to systematize this. Maybe I will change this at some point, but this is the best I have at the moment. And I believe the first generation is what I told you about by the League of Nations. A health organization starting with the interwar years, and then you have the second generation, which is still largely dominated by, in the health field, when atomic waste comes into the picture. And then it diversifies with the third generation, which has waste as a systemic question, packaging, beverage containers, and paper becomes important. By the 1980s and 90s, you get a concept called hazardous waste, which is new, even though, of course, you had waste before that was risky or dangerous, but this concept comes up at that time. Healthcare waste, which you may think is just a little thing, but it actually isn't. It's a pretty big issue. And I would argue that as new topics that are very much in the public attention or interest now is plastic and food waste. This is also something that you've probably heard of or have read about. What I find interesting about that is not only that you have these very different topics, but that none ever gets dropped. Every generation only adds new topics. The other ones still continue. They're at least not as far as I can see. There never really seems to be a state where one of these topics get really solved, in the sense that you say, okay, now we've got it. This is how we can do this, and then we no longer need to worry about this. It just becomes more. And this is also interesting when you look at how this work is being framed. So how can you address waste? And by far the most important in terms of the most frequent way of approaching this is by disposal. So this is all these topics that I've listed here: human waste, agricultural waste, municipal waste, atomic waste, packaging, paper, hazardous waste, healthcare waste, plastic, and food waste. The most important way that these are being discussed is, how do we get rid of it? What can we do where can we put this so it doesn't harm anybody? There's also some attention, but decidedly less in the field of reuse and recycling. Recycling becomes, actually recycling is being discussed almost from the beginning, and certainly about human waste, but also agriculture, municipal packaging, paper and plastic. And the least attention is how can we prevent this? You know, how there can really be two, in principle, two different approaches to waste. You can think, well, it's there, it's something that is just part of our economies, our societies, the way we live in this world, and then we have to find ways of dealing with it. And the other approach is to say, well, waste is something that is a result of the way we deal with this world, but it doesn't have to be there. It's the result of choices, and you can make other choices. And this last approach is relatively rare. You do find it, and you also find it repeatedly in different generations of waste discussions, but not very much, which I find also an interesting and noteworthy finding of why that is so. Second example, plastics. I guess this had to be there because plastics is not only one of the currently most important topics, but it is also interesting. You know, I'm a historian by training, so I find it interesting in the sense that it's a material that is one of the most serious and most widespread waste problems now today, and will be for a long time to come. But about half a century or a bit more, 60, 70 years ago, it basically didn't exist. It's really just maybe two generations that we're talking about here. So if you look at the 1950s, yes, it had been invented already, but basically, you know, the production is negligible, and then it just keeps growing exponentially. So at the time being today, we have about 7 billion tons. That's about 1 ton of plastic in the world per person. And that includes everybody, every baby, every person. So because it's relatively recent, people have tried, and there's a possibility to even do this, to calculate what has happened to all waste ever produced in the world. And so this is what's the result of that. This is about 8,300 million tons, thereabouts, according to this calculation. And of these, this part here, about 2,500 million tons, are still being used today, while the rest has all been discarded in some way. There's a relatively small part here which has been recycled. But of course, this is only gaining time, because plastic is difficult to recycle, and you can only do this once or twice at the utmost, and also not with all types of plastic. And it's very small also to begin with. There's a little bigger, but not very much bigger part here of 700 million that is has been incinerated, while the largest part, this part here, has been dumped someplace. And it's mostly on landfills, and part of that also in the oceans. So this is something that we're living with, that is somewhere on our earth, on our world, and that will, since plastic doesn't degrade very well, will continue to be there for a long time. How much of that goes into the ocean? That's probably, you know, in relation, not that much. This is an approximation. I got all this from Our World in Data, so these are not my slides. I'm borrowing them. This is a calculation for the year 2010, when here 270 million tons were produced as new plastic, and a little more than that was being discarded as waste. And part of that, roughly 100 million tons, were generated, or were discarded in areas next to the oceans, and about 8 million tons, give or take, ended up in the ocean. Nobody knows really how much plastic is in the ocean. The estimates you can see here is anything between 10,000 and 100,000 tons. I mean, that is a huge range. Basically, we don't know. But we do know that it's a lot. We've seen these here they're called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but actually it's not only in the Pacific and it's not only one patch. There are several such patches that have been discovered by now. This is more plastic waste than usual that accumulates because of the currents in the ocean. But that's about all that we know. We don't know the speed of the disintegration. We don't know the amount of plastic. Again, there the estimates have a very wide range. We don't know how it's distributed. We basically don't know how much is at the surface of the water. We don't know how much is on the ocean floor. And especially there, once it's on the ocean floor, when no oxygen enters, we don't know if it disintegrates at all, or if it just sort of sits there. We're just, under these circumstances, we don't have any empirical data to allow us to know how much, how it will react in the long term. And we don't know how many animals are dying from plastic waste, and we certainly don't know the long-term effects. And when long-term effects, I'm talking about centuries, which supposedly it will have. But since it is new, we just don't know. It's really a gigantic open-air experiment. We just do know that it's very likely it will have an important effect on our oceans. Where does it come from? From which sectors? Packaging by far the most, which is both an economic issue, of course, but it's also a social issue because it's a function of it's a function of two things. First of all, because the corporations use packaging to put their brand name on it, so it's a form of advertising. But it's also it's a result of how we shop, because many of us, most of us, we no longer go to shops and just take a little bag with whatever we need back home. But we use this. We buy it in packages, and we increasingly order things. So all this Amazon, Taobao. Of course, this needs extra packaging. And of course, it's social also. I mean, this is what I get here in my quarantine. I got all this water in plastic bottles. I use about 3 or 4 every day. Probably could be organized differently, but I produce a lot of waste today. Textiles, also both economic. The textile industry is one of the largest sectors in the economy, and a lot of people have their employment in these areas. But it is a huge source of waste, and you might also wonder, why do we have so many clothes? Do we need so many clothes? And when I say we, I mean mostly women. I mean, women have an almost endless absorption capacity for waste. I say this self-critically. I certainly have more than I need, and most of the other women that I know do. So why? And as long as we act like that, we somehow come up with this type of problem. And that's also relatively new, because it's only in the 20th century that a critical mass of people are wealthy enough to afford that many more clothes than they really need. So while it's good to be wealthy, the problem that we are getting with that is also very serious. So this would be something interesting also to look into. This is the countries that it comes from, the waste generation again in 2010. You can see by far the most important countries are the United States and China. Well, of course, on a per capita basis, it's much higher in the US than in China. And it gets into the ocean also to some extent through rivers, and that is particularly so in Asia, and in Asia, especially in China. So it's there that rivers are an important means of transport. So the rivers are also carriers of plastic waste. You may have followed that, is that China not only produced a lot of plastic, but it's also, until the year 2017, was the world's largest importer of plastic waste. So this is imported plastic waste, and here this is China. So it was about 70%. and the other countries share the rest. And these are the countries that were the sources of the imports. The largest one was Japan, then the United States, Thailand, which surprised me, and Germany, Belgium, the Philippines, Australia, and then the others here. As you may have followed, China then enacted a ban on basically all plastic waste. So it no longer imported the plastic because it was producing enough plastic by itself by that time. For years, the plastic that was imported was used as a raw material for further plastic production, but this was no longer necessary, was actually counterproductive. So in fact, China has begun now to export its own plastic waste. We don't yet have a very clear idea what's been happening to all these masses of plastic waste that China no longer takes. This is from a report that is very new, it just came out a few weeks ago by Interpol, that suggests that a lot of it is finding its way in illegal landfills somewhere, especially in Southeast Asia. So this is also a huge topic that will be difficult to, at least for students, difficult to investigate, but it's certainly one of the major stories of economic and environmental story that is unfolding as we speak. It's also exacerbated by COVID-19. Because I found these numbers quite staggering. There's now an estimated 129 billion face masks, disposable face masks, and 65 billion gloves used globally every month. And of course, they also end up somewhere. And the picture that you see here on the right, this is how I live at the moment. I get in quarantine, I get my food exactly like that, in these bags, and the person is carrying the face mask, which is good, which is necessary when you want to prevent infection, but this is where they end up. They must end up somewhere. And this is also something that future generations will probably identify the waste with or be able to time it. Second example, I will have to go faster, I think. Landfills, where does it all end up? There is the sanitary landfills, which we use or try to use or hope we use in industrialized countries, which is a fairly technological affair with measurements in place to prevent leaching or to reduce it, to take away the methane and to take away the leachate and to prevent the material from getting into the groundwater. You can have a look there. Without all this, this is just a dump. This just means nothing else is done. All this place just gets dumped into the world somewhere. And this is what you find in parts of the world. This is what you can get on a website called Waste Atlas, and which tries to document the most important landfills and dumps. And what you see is the yellow dots here are sanitary landfills, the red ones are just dumps. And what you see, first of all, is the sheer number. I mean, the United States basically is covered with landfills. You can't even see it anymore. And there's a lot in many other parts of the world. The red dots here are very much concentrated in low-income countries. So this is where you got the social and the political dimension there, is that it's a question of poverty. And with this question of poverty, of course, also come then additional problems, especially health problems. So this is the Waste Atlas that this organization, that's basically University of Essex, puts out. And it says that the typical dump site is in operation for 17 years, and almost 1 million people live within 10 kilometers of diameter, of radius, and more than 1,000 people work directly on the dump site as informal recyclers. That's the question of what do you call this? Are they scavengers? That's sort of derogatory. Informal recyclers, that's maybe even too nice a name for the kind of work that they do. And on the one hand, they suffer very serious health risks. It's not a healthy workplace at all. They do important recycling work. You have to acknowledge somewhere this is an important part of recycling, or a relatively large part that takes place in this way. At the same time, it is also a workplace for many, many people. If you multiply 1,300 by the number of sites that you have in the world, there are millions of people that gain employment this way. So how do you deal with that? There is one aspect, one example I wanted to go into a little bit more. It's AKBAR in Accra in Ghana, which gained notoriety as supposedly the world's largest e-waste dump site in pictures. And I've given you some of the headlines here. And this was in the headlines some years ago very much. And if you go on the internet, you still see some horrendous pictures here. And the story, the official narrative goes that this is where high-income countries, so especially from Europe and the United States, where they dump the e-waste, and people over there burn this and suffer the consequences, especially the health consequences. So the concept here is toxic colonialism or neo-imperialism, and it's certainly terrible pollution. This narrative is wrong. It has been shown repeatedly now that this is not only one-sided, it's just wrong. First of all, it's not that big. It's compared to many other places, especially in China, is actually relatively small. And it's not only for e-waste, there's actually a scrap yard. There's some e-waste, lots of it is vehicle waste. Burning does take place, but over here, what you see here is the cables that are gained through burning, but what is burned is mainly car tires. It's also a workplace for local and migrant workers. It's also terrible pollution. There's no doubt about that. But the e-waste that does come, basically nothing, only a fraction of that comes from high-income countries. Most of it comes from Ghana itself or from neighboring countries. So it's not such a black and white story. It's a much more nuanced story, because you can tell this as a story of victimization. You can also tell this as a story of entrepreneurship, in which people use the products that they have to make a living for themselves. Both of it contains pollution. I don't want to discuss that away, but the story behind that, or the interpretation, can differ quite substantially. So for topical areas, if you would be interested in getting into that, it's almost endless. You can have a waste of particular things. What is interesting and also necessary for academia is have stories of cities, of urban metabolisms, waste regimes, with changes in political systems, and I know Viktor is going to talk about that later on. The waste resource connection, when is something a waste, when is something a resource, and the social distribution, local, national, regional, global. And all this is applicable to the past, to the present, to the future. I would invite you to think about that. And thank you very much for your attention.